Okay, what was the name of Franklin Roosevelt's administration, Maddie?
Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal.
Very good. Truman's, Caitlin?
Fair deal.
Fair deal. And the name of the Eisenhower administration would be modern republicanism. Now, the administration of President Eisenhower would be much different philosophically from those presidencies of both President Roosevelt and President Truman. I'll tell you the difference. President Roosevelt and President Truman wanted Congress to pass their programs, and then they wanted Congress to carry out and make sure that those programs happen. Okay, I'll repeat that. Presidents Roosevelt and Truman wanted Congress to pass their programs, and then they wanted Congress to make sure that their programs were carried out properly. Eisenhower was just the opposite. He wanted Congress to shape their own programs, and he thought he was responsible to carry them out. It was totally different. I'll read that again. President Roosevelt and President Truman wanted Congress to pass their programs, and then they wanted Congress to make sure that his programs or their programs were carried out. Whereas Eisenhower wanted Congress to shape their own programs, and he saw it as his responsibility to make sure their programs were carried out, which is totally the opposite philosophy. He also expected his cabinet members to carry out the daily business of running the government, and only the most difficult problems were to be brought to him, which was a lot different philosophy. So what was the philosophy of President Roosevelt and President Truman? They wanted Congress to pass their programs, and then they wanted Congress to carry out their programs. President Eisenhower believed the opposite. He wanted Congress to shape their own programs, and he would be the man responsible to carry out Congress's programs. He also expected his cabinet members to handle the daily business of running the government. He was kind of a hands-off guy, and only the most difficult problems were to come to him. Okay? So a totally different philosophy. He's given a ton of power to who? To his cabinet and the Congress. And he only wants to be bothered if there's a major problem. Now, did some good things get done under this philosophy? They did. I'm going to give you 5 examples of legislation that was passed by Congress during the time that Eisenhower was president, during this modern republicanism, that was saw as very positive, even though he was kind of a hands-off guy. Okay, he let Congress do the work, and he made sure that things were taken care of from their end. Now remember, the Fair Deal, did it increase Social Security benefits? The Fair Deal? Well, so did modern republicanism. It increased the Social Security benefits that Truman passed to an additional 10.5 million. So under the modern republicanism administration of Dwight Eisenhower, Congress increased Social Security benefits to aid an additional 10.5 million people. What else did Truman do in the Fair Deal? He raised the minimum wage from what to what? Anybody remember? 40 to 75. Well, Congress raised the minimum wage during modern republicanism from that 75 cents an hour to $1 an hour. That was a pretty big deal. Man, we're making $1 an hour now on the minimum wage. So the minimum wage was raised from 75 cents an hour to $1 an hour. Also, third thing that happened during Eisenhower's administration is Congress authorized federal funds for medical research and the construction of new hospitals. Okay? The Eisenhower administration, during that time, Congress authorized federal funds for both medical research and for the construction of new hospitals. Government money, taxpayer money, paid for medical research and the construction of new hospitals. What else did the Fair Deal do? It cleared what? Slums. Well, modern republicanism continued that way of thinking, as Congress spent $500 million additional dollars for the clearance of slums across the nation and the building of low-income housing. So they continue that. $500 million was spent during the Eisenhower administration for the clearance of slums across the nation and the development and building of low-income housing. So both, there were some similarities. Social Security benefits were a similarity, the minimum wage, clearance of slums, some things that Eisenhower did differently as he authorized federal funds for medical research and the construction of hospitals. And for the first time, number 5, Congress provided student loans that would be financed by the government for college-bound students that were interested in the study of science. Okay, Congress provided student loans which would be financed by the government for college-bound students that were interested in the study of science. Now, you know who the president was that really took education on and made it the way it is today as far as financial aid and stuff? Was Lyndon Johnson. We'll talk about him way later. But Eisenhower started this student loan program for kids that wanted to go to college, and they would loan them money at a low interest rate if they were interested in studying the field of science. And there's a reason for that we'll talk about later. So those are 5 things, 5 examples of legislation that was passed by Congress during President Eisenhower's modern republicanism. Okay, I gave you a handout the other day with your ID sheet on the Eisenhower cabinet, and rather than you take a bunch of notes, I thought we'd just go over it the easy way, and we'll explain the Eisenhower cabinet, and you don't have to write anything down, okay? Yes. Oh, your stuff's right there. Oh, including your birthday present. Oh, good. Now, as you can see by the Eisenhower cabinet, anytime you have this many people and lots of replacements, it's a standard of a weak cabinet. So I could start this subtopic by saying that Eisenhower did have a weak cabinet. His first Secretary of State was John Foster Dulles. And he was appointed in 1953 and then was replaced by Christian A. Herter in 1959. And we'll talk about these a little bit. The bigger ones that are underlined are what we call identifications. He had 2 Secretaries of the Treasury during his 2 terms, George M. Humphrey and Robert B. Anderson. He had 3 Secretaries of Defense. That's not good when you have that many. Okay, he started with Charles E. Wilson in 1953, then went to Neil H. McElroy in 1957 and Thomas S. Gates Jr. in 1959. Not good when you change Secretary of Defenses 3 times in 2 terms. Okay? He had 2 different Attorney Generals. You can see Herbert Brownwell Jr. in 53 and William P. Rogers in 57. He did only have 1 Postmaster General during his 2 terms, Arthur Summerfield. He had 1 Secretary of Agriculture during the time, Ezra Taft Benson. He also had 2 Secretaries of the Interior, you can see, Douglas McKay and Frederick Seaton. He had 3 Secretaries of Commerce, Sinclair Weeks, Louis Strauss, and Frederick Mueller. 2 Secretaries of Labor, Martin P. Durkin and James P. Mitchell. Now, what do you notice about the years appointed on that position?
It wasn't the
Same year, so something happened not good, and we'll talk about that. And he had 3 different Secretaries of Health, Education, and Welfare. So you can see by looking at this cabinet sheet that he had a little bit of turmoil. And as I mentioned, President Eisenhower's cabinet was considered maybe the weakest in American history. Maybe the weakest in American history. You can see by the sheet, there were continual changes in his cabinet throughout his presidency. Here are 2 of the most pressing issues of his cabinet. Labor Secretary Martin Durkin resigned soon after appointment. He had had enough and got out of there. And to tell you about the quality of Defense Secretary Charles Wilson, his first Secretary of Defense, his position prior to being Secretary of Defense was he was the president of General Motors, and he was once quoted as saying, "What is good for General Motors is good for the country." Just not a real strong Secretary of Defense. Okay? Now, he did have 2 what they considered historians two bright spots in his cabinet. One was Secretary of Agriculture Ezra Taft Benson, and the other was his first Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. Those two were considered quality cabinet members in a very, very weak cabinet. That again would be Agriculture Secretary Ezra Taft Benson and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. Okay, that's going to take us to what I think is kind of fun. We're going to have a subtopic, 1953 at a glance. And we're going to tell you some things that happened in each month of the year of 1953. Kind of off the chart on history, but maybe you've heard some of this. So I'm going to ask my friend Pistol Pete if he knows what happened on January 1st of 1953. Absolutely, this kid is a genius. Hank Williams, who was a country music singer, died at the age of 29 while traveling through West Virginia. Okay? On January 1st of 1953, Hank Williams, country music singer, died at the age of 29 while traveling through West Virginia. He was on his way to a show in Canton, Ohio, and where did he die, Pete? In the back seat of his Cadillac limousine. They found him dead in the back seat of his Cadillac limousine. Now, you ever watch Monday Night Football? The guy says, "Are you ready for some football? A Monday night party." That's Hank Williams Jr. that does that. That would be Hank Williams' son. Okay, so anyway, Hank Williams was a country music phenom at the time, and he died on January 1st, 1953 at the age of 29 while traveling through West Virginia on his way to a show in Canton, Ohio, and he died in his sleep in the back seat of his Cadillac limousine. Hey, you know what happened on January 2nd of 1953? Mr. Republican, Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, was elected Senate Majority Leader. What does that mean? He's the highest ranking member of the Senate. Senate Majority Leader is a big time position. Not quite as powerful as the president, but maybe as powerful as the vice president. It's a big time political position. And on January 2nd of 1953, Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, Mr. Republican, was elected Senate Majority Leader. Anybody know what happened on February 17th of 1953 that involved Ethel and Julius Rosenberg? Is that you, Sherman? Tell us what happened on February 17th, 1953.
That's when they were arrested.
No, you're close though. They were convicted in 1951 of selling top secret materials to the Soviet Union, and they were sentenced to die in the electric chair for their crime. But what happened on February 17th? You may or not know this. What happened on that? Did you know? You probably didn't read that, but anyway, when you get sentenced to death, what do you normally do first before they electrocute you? What's that? Well, I mean, before that even. So you get convicted, you get sentenced to death. Before you get your date, you usually appeal. Okay? And what happened on February 17th of 1953, President Eisenhower rejected the appeal of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg for clemency. And as Caitlin said and I mentioned, in 1951, those two were convicted of selling top secret materials to the Soviet Union, and they were sentenced to die in the electric chair for their crime. Now they haven't, according to our timeline and history of what we're talking about, they haven't died yet. What happened on this date of February 17th is they had appealed to the President of the United States for clemency, for leniency, not to be put to death, and he rejected their appeal. So they're heading to the electric chair. Okay? March. Anybody, what happened on March 5th, 1953? Do you know, Kendra, what happened on March 5th, 1953? What? Genius! Joseph Stalin died. That a girl? Joseph Stalin died. The most powerful leader in the history of the Soviet Union died of a major stroke in Moscow on March 5th, 1953. Anybody here know what happened on March 26th of 1953? Anybody know anything about Dr. Jonas Salk?
That was me,
Remember what happened to him, or what he did on March
I think.
26th?
Is that when he created the polio vaccine?
Very good. God, you guys, awesome. Dr. Jonas Salk at the University of Pittsburgh reported a vaccine against polio had been tested successfully in 90 adults and children. On March 26 of 1953, Dr. Jonas Salk of the University of Pittsburgh reported publicly that a vaccine against polio had been tested successfully in 90 adults and children. Exciting. Two things in April, and you guys may remember this fellow. On April 8th of 1953, the bones of Sioux Chief Sitting Bull were moved from North Dakota to South Dakota, reburied after 63 years. So on April 8th of 1953, the bones of Sioux Chief Sitting Bull were moved from North Dakota to South Dakota and reburied after 63 years. Okay, moving on to May. Somebody was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for Literature, a fellow by the name of Ernest Hemingway. On May 4th of 1953, anybody know what the novel he wrote and he won the Pulitzer for was called? The Old Man and the Sea. Very good. So on May 4th of 1953, Ernest Hemingway was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Literature for his novel entitled The Old Man and the Sea. Now this is pretty interesting. On May 18th of 1953, Jacqueline Cochran became the first woman to fly faster than the speed of sound. How about that, ladies? May 18th, Jacqueline Cochran became the first woman to fly faster than the speed of sound, traveling over 760 miles per hour. May 18th, 1953, Jacqueline Cochran becomes the first woman to fly faster than the speed of sound, traveling over 760 miles an hour. June 2nd, we'll get into this later, the United States Supreme Court handed down a ruling that barred Washington, D.C. restaurants from refusing service to Negroes. On June 2nd, 1953, the United States Supreme Court sent down a ruling that would bar all restaurants in Washington, D.C. from refusing service to Negroes. My God, you're going to refuse service to Negroes in the nation's capital? Well, anyway, that was pushed all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court barred any Washington, D.C. restaurants from refusing service to Negroes. What else happened? What happened on June 19th, 1953? Caitlin? Huh? Yeah, June 19th, 1953, what happened? That's when Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed by electrical shock for their conviction of espionage. June 19th, 1953, the Rosenbergs were executed by electrical shock for their conviction of espionage. Okay, moving on to July. On July 1st of 1953, the United States accumulated the largest peacetime deficit in American history. The United States accumulated the largest peacetime deficit in American history. Dalton, what's a deficit in American history? Largest peacetime deficit. What's a deficit? That's when the United States government's financial is in the hole, right? You're in the red or you're in the black. They were in debt $9.4 billion on July 1st of 1953. It was the largest peacetime deficit in American history. If you folks ran your debit cards like the country runs our finances, you'd never make it. I mean, can you imagine that? The debt we're in. Okay, July 15th. Gentlemen preferred blondes, so to speak. How about it? Elliot, tell us what happened on July 15th, 1953.
The first Playboy magazine was released with Marilyn Monroe on the cover.
You pervert. That is not true.
No, I wrote it down.
A musical comedy film entitled Gentlemen Prefer Blondes debuted, starring Marilyn Monroe. I'm giving him a bad time, but I set him up for that Playboy magazine.
That was 1950.
Yeah, 1950, we'll talk about that later. 1953, July 15th, a musical comedy film entitled Gentlemen Prefer Blondes debuted, starring Marilyn Monroe, who actually was an awful actress. Okay, not known for her acting. But she did get some good roles, and we'll talk about that. When we get into Marilyn Monroe, we talk about the colorful 1960s. It's a whole other subtopic way down the line. We'll talk about Marilyn Monroe in detail and tell you everything she did in her life. And Gentlemen Prefer Blondes is kind of where she got her start being an actress. Okay, August. Now, Macklin, you might be somewhat interested in this. On August 8th of 1953, an American athlete